Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Tips for Presiding Over Board and Member Meetings Successfully, presented by Whiteford, Taylor & Preston's Piedmont and Tidewater Committee. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select telephone in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed. All attendees are in listen-only mode. You will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time during the presentation. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A period at the end. A reminder that today's webinar is being recorded and the information contained in this presentation is provided for general informational purposes only and is not intended to serve as legal advice. And an additional reminder is that this course is approved by the Community Association Managers International Certification Board to fulfill 1 hour of continuing education for the CMCA certification. A personalized course completion certificate for anyone attending the session in real time will be personally emailed by close of business today. Additionally, a copy of the audio recording and slide deck will be emailed to you within 72 hours of the completion of this live presentation. With all of that being said, I would now like to pass the presentation over to Chad Renard. Chad?
Well, welcome. We recognize that any one of you may have handled anything from a meeting of an association's members decided by acclamation to many meetings of the members involving contested votes for seats on a board that are coveted. We recognize that you may have handled board meetings where you are simply thankful to have quorum, to board meetings that are contentious between the board and residents, and perhaps even the board members themselves. We know this already about you because we have been there too. We are Whiteford, Taylor & Preston's Piedmont and Tidewater Committee of WTP's Community Association Practice Group. We are 5, sometimes more attorneys. We love all things Virginia. We love all things up and down I-95 from Richmond to Fredericksburg to Northern Virginia. And we love almost all things about common interest communities. While we hope that we will help you today manage board and member meetings of all sizes and temperaments, we know that you're here for the credit too. As Rachel said, this course is approved by the CAMICB for 1 hour of credit toward your CMCA designation. With you today, we want to navigate board and member meetings from the basics to the complex in about 10-minute increments. Please type any questions that you have in the chat and we'll answer those that we can within the hour or reach out to you afterward directly. As you probably already know, with meetings, we've got a lot of ground to cover. So without further ado, here are my excellent colleagues, Marla Diaz, Nasim Saidi, Kate Murphy, and Ed O'Connell. Rachel, next slide. Marla, take it away.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks. I'll join Chad in adding my thanks that you joined us this morning. I've been asked to do a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about this morning and some best practices to get you prepared for your good meetings. I don't know about you all, but I think one of the results that I have seen over the last 2 years of our pandemic behavior, and particularly trying to do so many meetings virtually, is that we are seeing a lot more contentiousness in our community association meetings, and they are becoming a little bit more difficult to handle and to make certain that you're still able to get the business of the association done in the context of those meetings. So one of the things that we think is really important to making certain that your meetings go well is what you do in advance of those meetings and how you get yourself prepared so that hopefully you are anticipating most of the problems that are going to arise during that meeting. I'm certain for most of you, you probably know in advance whether that meeting is going to be a problem meeting, and if there is an issue that's become a hot issue in the community that's got everybody a little bit in a tizzy and might make your time a little bit more difficult. So what our recommendation is you set yourself up for success by doing a few things in the advance of the meeting. And one of the first things, obviously, is understanding what your obligations are under both your governing documents as well as the relevant statutes for that particular meeting, so that you don't have somebody that tries to raise an issue either during or after the meeting that you've done something incorrectly. So the first thing is taking a look at your governing documents and making certain you understand what your quorum requirements are, either for a board meeting or for your members meeting. Make certain that you're complying with the notice requirements of the meeting. As you all probably know, particularly for members meetings, you may have a notice requirement that requires you far in advance of that meeting, sometimes 21 days, sometimes 30 days in advance, getting notice to your members. Some of them actually have a tricky language where they'll say not more than 60 days before the meeting, but not less than 20 days before the meeting, you have to send out notice. So make certain you understand that. Make certain you also understand what your governing documents say that notice needs to include. It's not consistent across all governing documents. Some require you to put in more details than others, and you want to make certain that you're complying with that. And then also understanding what your member forum requirements are. Obviously, we know that for all board and member meetings, there is an obligation that you include a members forum requirement, but this also includes any committee meetings. Your committee meetings also have to have a members forum. So making certain that you know in all of those circumstances that you're going to hold a members forum and at what point in the meeting that members forum is going to be held, so you make certain that you don't miss this important requirement. For your member meetings, it's also a very good idea to review what your governing documents say with regard to your proxy requirements. Again, this isn't consistent across governing documents. Some governing documents include the obligation that you have a witness's signature and address on the proxy. Some require that they're dated and signed. Actually, all of them require that they're dated and signed, but some of them require some additional things. And you want to make certain that when you're preparing those proxies for your meeting and making those available to your owners, that you have those available. And also that you know what those are in the event that someone submits their own homemade proxy, that they've included all of the relevant requirements so that you can actually accept it. If you're going to be doing an election at your meeting, determining in advance who you're going to appoint as the inspectors of your election and preparing them for what their responsibilities are going to be in the meeting in terms of collecting votes, reviewing proxies, and then ultimately submitting a report to the chair of the meeting as to what the election results are and what that needs to look like. One of the last really good things that you can do in preparing yourself is determining whether or not you're going to be using Robert's rules during the context of that meeting. One of the things that my colleagues are going to be talking to you about is how you can use Robert's rules in the course of your meeting to try to make certain that you're maintaining a controlled, civil, and hopefully efficient operation of your meeting. So one of the things you're going to want to look at is, do your documents either require that Robert's rules be used in the conduct of your meeting, or are they silent on that issue? In which case, Robert's rules provides that you can use those as long as they're not in conflict with your governing documents. So there may be circumstances that even though your governing documents don't say that they're going to use Robert's rules, that your organization actually makes the decision that you're going to use them because you think it's a good idea. Next slide, please. The next sort of thing you're also going to want to do is not only look at your governing documents, but also take a look at the relevant statutory provision. And at the bottom of this slide, you'll see we've included both the provision from the Condominium Act as well as the Property Owners Association Act that talks about what the requirements are for a meeting. And they are generally that they have to be open to all of your members. Again, this is regardless of whether or not they're members meetings, board meetings, or committee meetings. They have to be noticed to those meetings, to those members, to make certain that they know when and where to attend. And obviously those notice requirements are different depending on whether or not you're talking about a regularly scheduled board meeting, in which case you can just provide notice at the beginning of the year, or if it's a specially held meeting, and what you need to do in order to make certain that that special board meeting or that special committee meeting, that the notice of that reaches the largest number of your members so they have an opportunity to attend if they want. Making certain that minutes are going to be kept for those meetings, and having a conversation as to who's going to be responsible for those meeting minutes. And then also a good idea of what should be in those minutes. One of the things we're talking about, I find myself talking about constantly, is people who want to have your minutes be a transcript that records everything that happens in the meeting. And your recommendation from council that that's not how you do minutes, and that you in fact keep them limited to just those relevant portions of the meeting and the actual actions that are being taken by your board of directors or your committee or the members if it's a members meeting, and not trying to create a dialogue about what everything that happened at that meeting. And then of course the last, which is also contained in the statutory provisions, is the members forum obligation. And one of the things to recall about this that I think is pretty critical is that this is an opportunity for your members to comment. It is not an opportunity for your members to question either your board or your committee, or even in a members meeting, the board and the committees. There's sometimes an instinct that people want this to be like the prime minister's questions, where you get to go in and beat up the board a little bit, but that's not what this is intended to be. It's just a comment period. And so we typically recommend, particularly if you've got a contentious membership, that you really focus on it just being a comment period. Next slide, please. One of the other things to remember about your meeting minutes, about your meetings, is that for property owners associations and condominium associations, you do need to make certain that you are trying to hold a members meeting at least once a year. And I say trying to hold because obviously some of you all know that there are occasions where getting quorum for a members meeting is a very difficult thing to do. But you do have an obligation to at least schedule that meeting, notice that meeting, and prepare for that meeting. If you're not able to get quorum, that's a different issue, and we can talk about how to resolve that. But you do at least need to make certain that your communities are scheduling an annual meeting of your members. One of the things that has been an advantage of the pandemic is that the General Assembly has now allowed us to do voting other than just conducting voting in the context of the meeting. You can now do an in-person voting at the meeting, a proxy voting at the meeting, or if you want to do an absentee ballot so that people want to vote before the meeting and submit their ballots in that fashion, you're able to do this. And this has actually made it a lot easier for us to do electronic voting, which is really helpful because it typically more people are willing to participate if you're doing electronic voting and they don't have to fill out a form and put it in the mail. So it's something to really give some consideration to. But in advance of your meetings, you're going to want to plan how you're going to do that election and how you're going to allow your owners to participate. And it is important to note that even with this statutory change, you should take a look at your governing documents and make certain they don't specifically prohibit voting by an electronic means outside of your meeting, so that you're not going to run afoul of that particular requirement and end up having to throw out some of your votes, because that certainly is not something that any of us ever want to do. And obviously you're also going to want to make certain that you've got the appropriate resolution that allows you to do both electronic meetings and electronic voting. And again, at the bottom of this slide, we've included the relevant statutory provisions so you can take a look at those. Next slide, please. I talked about a couple slides ago using Robert's rules, but it's also a good idea to consider not only the Robert's rules portion and how you're going to use those, but what kind of things you all are going to do to anticipate the problems that may very well arise in your meeting and order your meeting in such a way that you avoid that particular problem. One of the things to think about is, are you going to do in person or are you going to do virtual meetings? Obviously, if you've got a particularly contentious issue, one of the nice things about virtual meetings is you can mute everyone but the members of that. If it's a board meeting, the members of the board. If it's committee meeting, the members of the committee, except during the members forum. And that sometimes allows you to maintain order in the context of that meeting. If you're going to do an in-person meeting, then you should be thinking about making certain that the chair understands their roles and responsibilities, which Nasim's going to talk to you about in just a minute, so that they can maintain order in the context of the meeting. You also want to think about how you're going to set up your members forum. Are you going to do it at the beginning of the meeting? Are you going to do it at the end? What kind of time limits are you going to set on that members forum? What kind of time limits are you going to set on each individual that's participating? All of that can be used to set expectations in advance. If people know members forum won't last more than 30 minutes and they know that they won't have more than 2 minutes to speak, they're going to be more compliant with those limitations and requirements as opposed to trying to announce them while they're already talking. You want to consider whether or not you're going to allow participation in the chat function during your meeting if you're using a virtual meeting. And this is something that generally we don't recommend participation in chat, particularly during board and committee meetings, because it can be very distracting for your board members and committee members. And obviously the point of the meeting is to allow those individuals to do their work, and they can't do that if they keep getting nudged by chats. And then finally, you want to consider whether or not a parliamentarian should be appointed. And we're going to talk about that today as well. If you can go to the next slide, please. And then finally, in preparing for your meeting, it's a good idea to set the tone at the start of the meeting. Have your chair talk about what the purpose of the meeting is and how it is that civility and order in the context of that meeting will allow everyone to get their viewpoint expressed while at the same time being respectful to one another and allowing the meeting to efficiently operate. And this is, I think, always a really good idea, particularly if you're anticipating problems, is just to remind people up front, we're all neighbors. We're here to try to do some important things that need to be done, whether it be the election of new board members, or if it's a board meeting, a consideration of a significant issue, and that there's going to be the reasonable amount of participation allowed by the members, but it needs to be done in a civil way, or ultimately you may be in a position you've got to adjourn that meeting and you won't be able to get your business done. So setting that tone up front is a really good way to get started. And I'm going to now turn it over to Nasim, who's going to talk to you a little bit about what your presiding officer can do to help you with keeping control and setting the tone of these meetings.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Nasim Saidi, and I'm Associate Attorney at the Community Association section of Whiteford Taylor Preston. Thanks for joining us today. I will be briefly going over the president's role in association meetings and what is expected of the president. And you will see in almost all association governing documents a language that says president shall preside over meetings of the association. There also, the Roberts rules also states that if the president is unavailable, then the vice president presides. And if neither are present, then the secretary or some other member calls the meeting to order, and a chairman is elected to serve in that role only while the president and the vice president are absent. Next slide, please. The president has a critical role at meetings to essentially make sure that the meetings go smoothly, maintain order, to ensure that the rules are followed. And Robert's rules has very specific duties for the presiding officer at meetings. And those duties, again, it has a lot to do with making sure the meeting goes as it should and all the rules are followed. And it starts with opening the meeting at an appointed time, announcing the order of business, recognizing members, and then stating and putting to vote all motions, as well as protecting the assembly from any unwanted motions or any distractions. And later my colleague will discuss how those motions can be handled. And then also is enforcing the rules against those interrupting the conduct of business, deciding all questions of order, responding to member inquiries, and then declaring the meeting adjourned. And next slide, please. Another important duty for the president is to make sure that all the votes are properly cast. Once all the votes are in, to declare the polls closed and then announce the votes. And next slide, please. So with the president essentially in charge, it is important that him or her takes his or her time to ensure that all the votes are in and everything is done as it should and correctly, and to manage any interruptions. And in doing that, there's some preparation that should be done prior to the meeting. And those are making sure to have copies of the bylaws, declarations, and any election rules. Having the membership list and list of all committees and their chairs. And it's also a good idea to have a script to make sure that the president know what to do in certain situations and what the order is and also what the agenda is. And also a copy of the parliamentary authority if there's no parliamentarian. And it's important that the managers ensure that presiding officer has access to all those documents before the meeting. And so, next slide, please. So what if things go wrong and the meeting is not going as expected? There's either some suspected rule violation or a lot of motions and a lot of distractions and some error may have happened. And in that situation, then the presiding officer can elect someone called a parliamentarian. And that can be anyone who is able to consult with the president during the meeting and to give advice. Someone certainly that the president knows would be the best person to help the president resolve any issues. And if you next slide, please. The parliamentarian will not just go take over the role of the president. He or she is just there to consult with the president. The parliamentarian doesn't speak to the entire membership unless it's really necessary, and to call attention any errors that may affect the substantive rights of the members. And the parliamentarian is not there to take over the role of the president. And the presiding officer still may choose whether or not they want to follow the parliamentarian's advice. Next slide, please. The parliamentarian has a duty to remain impartial. So the parliamentarian does not make any motions, does not participate in any debates, or vote on any questions unless is a member of the body and is casting a ballot. So if there's a member who wants to be able to make a motion and wants to be able to speak to the members, then that member should not be a parliamentarian. Once that position is accepted, the parliamentarian can't temporarily relinquish that position in order to exercise the rights that were mentioned earlier. So as sort of a conclusion, it's very important for the president to take his or her time and be comfortable and make sure things are done right and not really rush through things, because certain mistakes could impact the substantive rights of the members. So now I will hand it off to my colleague Katie Murphy to discuss how motions can be handled.
Hi everyone. Again, I'm Katie Murphy. I'm an associate in Community Associations at Whiteford Tidewater and Preston. Thank you for joining us. Today I'm going to talk about rules surrounding motions at board meetings. I'll start by saying that motions are important. They are the main tool the boards can utilize to keep the meeting flowing and to accomplish business. Whenever a board member wishes to make a motion, they can simply state, "I move to blank." And that blank can be a matter to discuss, debate, or procedural, such as I move to adjourn. I move to go into executive session. Today, we'll be focusing on motions mostly up for debate. So of course, once a motion is made, it must be seconded. The meeting chair will then state the question on the motion, which will open up the discussion or debate. Next slide. Once the chair states the question, the motion is now active on the floor for debate. As necessary, the presiding officer will clarify who has the floor and whose turn it is for discussion. He or she may also set time limits on the total amount of discussion and time each person may speak. And this is a very important authority of the presiding officer, and it's very useful in contentious meetings and debates. It will help to maintain the peace. And also remember, if you have a particularly complex motion, it's fine to draft it ahead of time. That will help to narrow the debate and keep things focused. Next slide. So Robert's rules also suggest additional procedures for discussion of motions. It suggests that each member may speak for only 2 times. No member can argue for longer than a predetermined amount of time, and that helps to prevent rabbit holes and digressions. It also helps to limit the discussion to the merits of the actual question on the floor. Robert's rules also suggest that remarks may be made to the chair only, so you're not fighting with other board members. And of course, you want to keep remarks courteous and civil. Next slide. When the time of discussion has expired or the presiding officer is confident everyone who wanted to speak has, the presiding officer will put the question to vote. And votes may be by voice, hand, standing, or any method to ensure accuracy of the result, including redoing the vote by another method. So if a vocal vote is unclear, you're going to want to put the vote to a hand vote until you're certain you've gotten an accurate result. And then the presiding officer will announce the vote. Next slide. So now we're going to transition into meeting minutes. Robert's rules provides that minutes should mainly be a record of what was done, not what was actually said. So think actions taken, motions that were voted approval or denied, not a literal transcript of who said what. Next slide. You'll also want to include in your minutes the date, time, place, and kind of meeting, whether it was a special meeting, an annual meeting, a board meeting. You'll also want the list of attendees, who the presiding officer is, any staff present. And you'll also want to note that quorum was met to show that the meeting was valid and in compliance with your bylaws. And then you'll also want to approve the prior meetings minutes as well. Next slide. Motions should, again, be brief and explanatory for the rationale of the discussion, not the actual discussion or debate. There's no good reason to include all of the discussion in your meeting minutes. It can really only cause harm and legal liability. Comments can be misconstrued, and you just don't want too extensive of meeting minutes. Last but not least, you're not going to take meeting minutes or record anything that goes on in executive session. There's certain reasons you can go into executive session, and after you come out of executive session, you will still, in the open, make a motion and vote on what was approved, but not actually the discussion in the executive session. And with that, I'll pass to Ed O'Connell.
Good morning, everyone. I get the fun task of talking about the disruptive attendees, the problems that you mostly will see at members' meetings, not necessarily board meetings. You all know these people. They're the know-it-alls, the dictators, otherwise sometimes called the bullies. and the complainers. Well, the key to dealing with this, as you've heard it talk about, my colleagues talk about previously, is preparing for dealing with those people in advance. And a lot of this is going to fall upon the presiding officer. So the key is for the presiding officer to know the audience, know who's going to be attending. You will generally know most of the time if there's going to be problems with certain owners if they should arrive at the meeting. So prepare and plan for the meeting along those lines. The first thing, and I think one of the most important things, is give a welcoming speech. Talk about the rules, how the meeting is going to be conducted. You may seek approval of the agenda depending how your documents are set up, but just set a positive overview for the meeting from the start. That's the first step, but we all know that doesn't always help the situation. There's going to be people who argue or try and dominate the meeting. So when you're dealing with those type of people, there's things that you can do when they first start to argue. So think about this along these lines. Draw with the arguer, the person who loves to debate, create controversy, they know what they're doing, so on and so forth. Listen to them at first. Give them a minute to speak before you react. You may draw them out a little bit with the question, because remember, you're giving the big picture to the community, and the community is looking for the presiding officer to lead. That way, if you know this is going to be a problem, this would be helpful to have a parliamentarian also at the meeting. But just plan for this. And then if it need be, turn it over to the group if they want to discuss it further, depending on the nature of the complaint. Now, if the person becomes obnoxious or becomes difficult, what we'll call the minor infraction, it's all right to reproach them. Start gently, then move into it and see how they react. If it's repeat minor infractions, you can call for some more appropriate action to be taken, but you have a lot of tools that you can use along those lines, and we'll talk about them as we go forward. There's also the situation you see, the people are having side meetings. They're having a full discussion about other things during the meeting, which can be interruptive along those lines. Now, we won't see them as much at virtual meetings because most of the time everyone is muted during that, but should it happen, just be prepared to deal with it. And one thing you can do is control or limit the chat during a virtual meeting. Set ground rules in advance, and that's what the presiding officer will talk about there. Or just stop the meeting if it's a live meeting and people are in person, and wait for people to calm down and be quiet. The key here is, as you'll see, next slide, please, is to keep it professional. It's never going to be personal. You want to stay calm, you want to listen, and here's the tough part: avoid knee-jerk reaction, because there's going to be times when people are going to get confrontational and in the face of the presiding officer. And that's when the chances, the presiding officer just needs to be calm, take their breath, look what's happening, and then react. Keep in mind, the presiding officer under Robert's rules doesn't have to recognize members making repeated and dilatory motions. It's really just looking at the audience and addressing it that way. Now, there's going to be times when the behavior is extreme. And so what are your options there? Well, the first thing I would do is, if it becomes uncomfortable, suggest a temporary recess as an option. That goes to the membership. So you're overruling the person that's being argumentative or confrontational. And so let's take a 5 or 10 minute break for tempers to calm down, for people to gather their composure and go there. If it still doesn't work, you can take more serious actions. You can go for a motion for an apology. You can ask the offending party to leave the meeting. And sometimes this may require a vote of the membership, but don't be afraid to do it. The key, as I've said before, and as my colleagues, is preparation. It's keeping it professional, not personal. And you just got to take those steps going forward. So last option, there's always the adjournment process. And hopefully you don't get to that. But if you have to, say we'll just reschedule the meeting. If the meeting it's getting out of control, it's truly disruptive. I think in my career, I've only done it twice. And I've been doing this for over 20 years, where we've actually been at a meeting where we had to take a break and then just reschedule for another day to give people a chance to get their composure and work through the issues and then come back. And I will tell you, in both cases, the person that was causing the problems came back and they were calm, cool, and collected, and we were able to get through the meeting. Now, I'm not gonna say it's always gonna happen, but it can be very helpful. So that's, if I said it once, I'll say it again. Preparation is the key. Just know anticipate this is going to happen. The other nice thing is with virtual meetings, always keep this in mind because you can turn them off. Don't be afraid to turn them off. Tell them that's what's going to happen, and you just silence them so they can't speak further. With that said, I'm going to turn this over to Chad again. Chad?
Well, thank you, Ed. All right. So once a presiding officer reads the results of an election, the next best thing for that presiding officer to do is call for a motion to adjourn. 99% of the time, the body will agree with the presiding officer that adjourning is the next best thing to do, and they will vote to adjourn by acclamation. As one of the final tasks to conclude a meeting of the members, both the presiding officer and management should ensure that the ballots and proxies cast are kept as records of the association. These ballots and proxies may be examined later by an owner making a request that complies with the Property Owners Association Act or the Condominium Act, meaning the member has stated a proper purpose for the examination in writing and given a 5-day notice to allow the association to arrange for that owner's examination. Then there's that other 1% of the time. A voting result may still be contested under Robert's rules. A contest or objection by a member is called a point of order. The reasons any member may make a point of order could be several. With electronic balloting now commonplace, someone may not have been sent the link to vote. Or, regardless of the type of balloting used, someone was elected who was not named on the deed. Or, notice was deficient of the time or date of the meeting or the types of permissible voting. In general, before we adjourn a meeting, we want anyone who wants to vote at a meeting to vote. Because if I must choose between explaining to a judge why or why not a member was allowed to vote, I know it's far easier to explain why that person was permitted to vote, unless I can point to a specific prohibition on that person from voting under Robert's rules. So when a point of order is made, I think two things. One, I want my advice to be right. And two, I also want to get a decision on that point of order back to the body as fast as I can, and I'll act accordingly. There's nothing wrong at the moment a point of order is made with recessing the meeting to consulting Robert's rules. If there's something I can point to in Robert's rules, not only am I going to show it to the presiding officer, but often I'm going to read that sentence or section of Robert's rules to the entire body. Once I am confident my cite to Robert's rules is correct, then a point of order should be decided by the body, much like any other motion. And as mentioned, I want the decision to be made on a point of order out of my hands like a hot potato. I also want the decision on a point of order out of the hands of the presiding officer whom I'm advising. So if you are the presiding officer, when a point of order is made, have the point of order restated. Allow time for the parliamentarian to research it. Then look for a second from the body. If a second is made, allow the members to discuss whether they agree or disagree with the point of order and what should be done about the point of order if the body sustains it. Next slide. In truth, probably everyone has a different idea of what is fair to do when a point of order appears to have merit. Robert's rules appears to recognize this onslaught of opinion is coming from the body too, as Robert's rules suggest several different options to handle a meritorious point of order. For example, if it appears one or a few members did not vote and they should have, the assembly may decide to allow those members to cast their votes. Or if it appears more than a few members did not vote who should have, the Assembly may decide to reopen the polls. Or if it appears someone ineligible won, the Assembly may decide to hold a recount, to hold another vote. Or, while I've not seen Robert's rules authorize it specifically, I believe the Assembly may decide to award that seat to the person with the second most votes. That's why, with so many options, it's often good to use discussion of a point of order to build consensus among the body if possible. It's already been a long night at this point, and any way to keep the night from going longer will probably be appreciated by the body. But if discussion does not appear to be pointing to a desired resolution that most of the body will support, be prepared to decide the point of order by a roll call vote. Remember, only a majority of the body is needed to decide a point of order. So once that majority appears to have been achieved, and particularly after everyone who wants to speak about a point of order has spoken once, then it's best to call a vote on that point of order. Next slide. I think I can safely speak for anyone who has attended a meeting anywhere that a motion to adjourn is everyone's favorite motion of all time. To adjourn means to close the meeting, and any business of the association that is unfinished falls to the floor, or it fails. But the motion to adjourn is, to borrow from baseball, the moment we're rounding third and heading home. Because although the motion to adjourn may be made, we're not home yet, we're not done yet. A motion to adjourn has mechanics that must be followed beyond simply saying those words we all long to hear. I motion to adjourn. First, the motion to adjourn is a privileged motion. The motion is given precedence over other motions and may be made while another motion is pending. Robert's Rules itself recognizes the motion to adjourn may be the cure for motions that have become dilatory, or those motions raised often by a small minority of the Assembly to prolong a meeting on matters that are inconsequential to the majority. So candidly, the presiding officer can and should call for a motion to adjourn, much like Ed said, should motions of no consequence start to be made. The motion to adjourn, frankly, is another arrow in the quiver of the presiding officer for dealing with an interruptive owner whose tactics often include keeping a meeting going for as long as that person wishes to keep on talking. Of course, gauge the temperature of the room when calling for a motion to adjourn. If the motion is premature or perhaps made during heated argument, the motion to adjourn may fail. And I've certainly seen a motion to adjourn fail in my career. If, on the other hand, folks look exhausted, or more importantly, no one from the Assembly is asking for the floor, the motion to adjourn is probably right. The motion is often cathartic. I've been at meetings where pitchforks and broomsticks have been out and sometimes pointed right at me. But on the adoption of a motion to adjourn, smiles often return, and often even those who do not like what the presiding officer did, or even maybe what I had said, will advise or console us with comments such as they realize we're just doing our jobs. And if I can conclude a meeting without a contest to the procedure used, then I feel that I've done my job by serving the best interest of the association, regardless of the result. I never care who wins. So the mechanics for adjourning a meeting is paramount, and one worth discussing in great depth or more depth today. First, of course, have a motion to adjourn made by someone in the Assembly. Have a second. There's no discussion required on the motion to adjourn. Acclamation may be used to decide a motion to adjourn. If acclamation has one or a few dissenters, it's best to acknowledge who votes against the motion to adjourn and tally either their votes or par values and declare the meeting over if a decisive majority carries the motion to adjourn. Or if acclamation has several dissenters, be prepared to do a roll call vote particularly if results are assigned par values. As my colleague Katie excellently suggested, you want the result to be correct. You want to have confidence in the result, and a roll call is always the way to achieve that if other methods such as voice or hand are unsuccessful. And of course, obviously, a motion to adjourn can be repeated later in a meeting if it is unsuccessful earlier in that meeting. Now, meetings can end at a predetermined set time. First, however, we have to distinguish that a set end time for a meeting of the members is probably not a good idea. But a set end time for a board meeting may very well be a great idea. I'll advise between now and probably the end of my career as a common interest community lawyer that no meeting of the members end at a set time. Meeting of the members are just not held frequently enough. How long counting the ballots will take is always an unknown at those meetings. And I'm uncomfortable with a board in advance of a meeting of the members limiting the time in which the members can conduct the portion of the association's business reserved to them by their governing documents. On the other hand, I'm very comfortable with boards ending their meetings at a set time for the inverse of all the reasons I just gave for meetings of the members never ending at a set time. Board meetings are more frequent, so matters not decided at any one meeting can be considered again quickly at the next board meeting, often only a month away. Boards cannot decide anything by secret ballot, so intuitively, there are no secret ballots to count. And I think directors welcome a designated end time to their meetings. They may even admit a set end time is one of the perks of the job. So much like a board may adopt an agenda at the beginning of its meetings, it can also adopt a set time for the meeting to end. Then the meeting ends at that time, and the need for a motion to adjourn is dispensed with for that particular board meeting. Next slide. Confusingly, an adjournment is different from an adjourned meeting under Robert's rules. An adjournment terminates the meeting. Meeting is over. But there will be times when the business of a meeting cannot be completed in one evening, so that meeting will need to be resumed at, wait for it, an adjourned meeting. Reasons to finish the business of the association on another day can be several. Ballots need to be counted, a point of order needs to be resolved, a point of law may need to be researched. But it's important to remember that a motion to adjourn a meeting to another time is a motion that belongs to the body. It's the body's choice whether to adjourn to another day. A very narrow exception is held by the presiding officer, who may adjourn in case of an emergency. So while a fire is an obvious example of an emergency, another less intuitive emergency may be when the meeting runs past the designated time the whole of the meeting has been rented. There may be nowhere else to go. I have had an instance when a meeting continued in a parking lot in good weather, but barring that, hopefully the assembly will agree that a meeting is best concluded on another day when time is up on your rental hall. And it's so important as a practical matter that if a meeting must be adjourned to another day, pick the date for the meeting to resume and make that date part of the motion to adjourn. If the available date to resume is unknown, designate if either the president or the board will pick the date to resume the meeting and make that decision part of the motion to adjourn. Don't leave the date to resume the meeting or the manner in which that date will be selected open-ended. Finally, while your governing documents may require it, ironically, Robert's Rules does not require notice of an adjourned meeting. However, notice to the membership of the resumption of an adjourned meeting is obviously desirable. And I think any member can participate in the adjourned meeting once that meeting is resumed, the same as any member who shows up late on night one of a meeting can participate as soon as that person arrives. This is the end of our prepared comments. Any questions you may have, please put in the chat. We'll be happy to answer those. Again, just to remind you, everyone who has registered for this class, we'll send out a participation certificate today. And if for any reason you don't get it, feel free to email me. I apologize. I will tell you, yes, I'll get you the certificate. I'll apologize, and I'll even offer to take you out for a beer. That said, Rachel, are there any questions?
Yes, Chad, we have a couple. We have a board member who is extremely critical and bullying of other board members during the meetings. How do you handle it when the board member who has a right to participate is creating the problem?
That falls in Ed's segment, so I'm going to punt to my excellent partner, Ed O'Connell.
Well, Chad, thank you very much. My suggestion would be, as you call the board member out, you don't allow the bullying to take place. Remember, that board member is one of 5 or one of 7 or one of 3 board members. So that's the hard part. You're going to have to confront them and say, this behavior is clearly not appropriate, and don't stand for it. That can often be difficult, but that's the only way the group is going to be able to work together, because you don't want other board members to be intimidated or afraid to speak because that person happens to be there and is bullying other board members. And I know that's not the easiest thing to say, but it's the best way to address it. If it continues, then you may have to take further steps along those lines, including, in the worst case scenario, seeking the removal of that director for that very behavior. But you cannot tolerate it and don't allow it.
And to follow up to that question, there was mention of, what to do when it rises to the level of hostile environment discrimination. What would you suggest?
If it should get to that level, that's where you contact the association's attorney and get them involved. They can better address the legal options that would be available given the nature of the specific behavior. But you need to act promptly and quickly on it when it gets to that level, because you don't want a director feeling uncomfortable to the point where a complaint could be filed, and it could be not only the board member, it could be the management employee as well. So take prompt action, and that's when you bring in legal counsel.
Great, thank you.
If I may, Rachel, supplement. In my mind, and I'm sorry to say I found myself in this position a handful of times. Fortunately, it is not often, but certainly every time it occurs, it's memorable. I have a checklist of what I would do when the behavior continues. So often I begin just by simply reminding the person the meeting's being recorded, if that is in fact the case. Sometimes that cools the situation when the person realizes they're on video and can be seen later. If it continues, it really falls upon the presiding officer to calmly bring the person back into order. And if that fails, to begin to motion to either ask the person to stop interruptions or even ask to exclude the person from the meeting, which can be very tricky when the meeting is in a common element or a common area. If it starts to rise to the level that Ed tackled, where claims are now being made that are discriminatory and possibly opening the association to liability, by all means, just adjourn the meeting, because there's really nothing on the business of the association that is going to be of more significance than that behavior may expose the association to liability. And finally, I'm sorry to say, not everyone stays in their seats during these meetings. And when folks have become disruptive to the point that they're beginning to enter my personal space or someone else's, retreat. There's no reason to engage that person. At that point, it is fair. It is the right thing to do to retreat, and hopefully that person will come to their senses. And again, if that is not possible, adjournment is always the best way to go, even to the point where if the presiding officer has to use that rare exception for adjournment in case of emergency. And as Marla had mentioned, you know, probably Ed and I and Marla are all speaking of experiences that have happened over the last 2 years, really when we began, when we entered COVID and the virtual meeting became more common, and eventually the hybrid meeting spawned from that.
Thank you, Chad. I think that does it for our questions today. So with that said, I want to thank the Whiteford team and thank everyone for attending today's webinar, Tips for Presiding over Board and Member Meetings Successfully. On behalf of Whiteford, Taylor, and Preston, thank you for joining us today and stay well.